All right. Good evening, everyone. Good Monday evening. We are back again, here to talk about why South Africa is not doing so lacquer, like most people in the political sphere. Today, we are dealing with a nice little think piece that Leo has kindly furnished us with on a strange feature of both our political system and the Americans, which is there's a paradoxical difference. The main one being that they have a lot of high-level political assassinations, but not many killings of low-level political functionaries and officials. Whereas we have the exact opposite: enormous amounts of violent crime and almost no assassinations of high-level politicians. We don't see people gunning down MPs. We don't see people gunning down city mayors. We don't see people gunning down presidents. What we do see is lots and lots of low-level violence. So how did you sort of first notice this, and what was your first conclusion that you drew?
Well, sort of the first thing I noticed was that in South Africa, we have an absolutely tremendous amount of political violence at the very, very local level. Ward councillors are, especially in KZN, it's probably one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. The amount of violence over these very, very low government positions is absolutely rampant, but it doesn't translate up the system, seemingly. People haven't engaged in this sort of violence at the higher levels of South African politics for quite a long time. And when I look at obviously this is inspired in part by the attempted assassination on Donald Trump. And what I've noticed is that in the US, obviously there's the factor of people having, very ready access to firearms, but people have that in South Africa as well. What I was mainly concerned with was the sort of dehumanization and creation of the opposition as a legitimate target for violence that is present in the United States and in the discourse of American media. And what sort of made me acutely aware of this is just listening to American commentary when it is designed for American ears. In South Africa, our view into the American sort of ecosystem is perhaps not as robust as we like to think it is sometimes. We have some of the most mainstream, most tepid sort of understanding of how Americans speak about each other, at least when it comes to politics. When I listen to online streamers, for example, people who are technically alt media, but they have absolutely massive platforms, millions of subscribers, tens of millions of views every single month. These are people that do create the narrative from the ground up in the US. And what I found is that they are in every possible way except the absolute most explicit admission, they are creating the environment where the opposition is a legitimate target for violence. So if you listen to someone on the left, you might hear something like the Republicans are trying to instill a dictator. If they get power, then it's going to be the end of democracy. Trump is like Hitler in waiting. And Republicans are like subhuman. They're going to take all your rights away, and they hate you, and they would prefer if you were dead. Then on the other side, you get a similar sort of sentiment, but they'll claim that the right is. So they'll claim that the left is trying to rig the elections, that they are trying to create this environment where they'll just essentially rule forever, one way or another. And although we can have a very interesting conversation about the legitimacy of either side's concerns, the result is the same. Both sides are essentially gearing up for targeting the other as a legitimate cause for violence. If you're sincerely arguing, so if you're sincerely arguing that the other side is going to literally end democracy in one way or another, you are at least making it clear that them being killed would not be a bad thing, similar to Hitler getting assassinated before becoming Chancellor of Germany, for example.
Yeah, no, I mean it's hard to, how should I put it? It's hard not to see this kind of divide as leading somewhere nasty. There have been commentators have been noticing this for some time. I mean, some like to get a bit hysterical about it. You've got the guy, what's his name, Tim Pool, who always talks about, there's a coming civil war and so on and so on.
Tim Pool is the worst when it comes to this sort of thing. Absolute. I would say in general, it's the left that's probably slightly more responsible for it, but Tim Pool in particular just absolutely blows my mind.
No, but the thing about him is he takes the sort of like, well, I'm a sensible centrist. I'm actually a liberal. I just think blah blah blah. The thing is, in order to get attention for the topics he's talking about, he always says the apocalypse is around the corner. But fortunately, I don't think too many people take his commentary that seriously. What is sort of more salient is that things have gotten obviously very crazy for the Americans, even at the ground level. You listen to almost anyone talking about life in America now; it's clearly gotten quite nuts. You can look at the commentary from journalists like what's that guy, Andy Ngo, who looks at all of the political violence and organized political violence in the Pacific Northwest. And the very obvious thing of the George Floyd riots that put an end to lockdown because, a righteous protest can't carry diseases. But you do find that radicalization and that polarization of the society it's a lot more severe than I think we even have it down here. What's paradoxical is that the stakes that they're playing for are not as clearly existential as the ones that we're playing for, and yet we're much more cautious. I think the difference is that we've seen, in living memory, we've seen very serious, real, tangible political violence. And I remember reading a book. It was written in 2013, I think, and it was called Chieftaincy, State and Democracy. And it was written by a sociologist who was studying traditional governance in South Africa. And he spent a few months in 3 different kinds of traditionally governed areas in, rural KZN and Eastern Cape. And he looked at them and he said, one of the remarks that stuck with me is that they talk about, the people who live there talk about how they find their traditional leaders to be better because they are not political. It's not that there isn't some kind of politics that goes down in traditional circles, but it's constrained in a certain way. They don't like dealing with anything that involves political parties because that part of the world was torn apart by absolutely extraordinary violence. They had what is objectively, by any measure, a civil war in this country for nearly 15 years. And so there's a very concrete understanding that getting involved in popular politics is risky and potentially dangerous. And I mean, even those of us who are a little bit sort of stuck in our suburban bliss, we'll be aware of the Durban riots, for example. Everyone knows about those. So there's a much more the kind of violence that we see isn't something that because we've got a lot of money we just clean up. It's something where people feel it for years afterwards. People die in the streets in large numbers, and America. Well, America's got a different approach to this. There's a feeling of unreality around a lot of these protests that they experience. Even if it destroys the central business district of Minneapolis, there's enough money in the insurance and reinsurance sectors that everyone just rebuilds within a little while. And there's the feeling that this stuff isn't really permanent, no matter how bad it gets. And I think the thing is that they're not close enough to the breadline to really feel the fear. So that's one aspect of it. But I think you were quite right in pointing out that we don't feel the need to push back very hard. And you noticed something very, very interesting. You picked up on the DA not pushing back too hard on violence from the far left, from Julius Malema, because they understood that their path to the government was through the ANC. And I think that was quite an astute observation, because I hadn't thought of it that way at all. Somehow, I haven't been. That's been a little bit of a hole in my analysis. Is I haven't been able to retrospectively look back and see the DA's behavior as being shaped around this aim, even though, as I pointed out, it's quite clear that they've been aiming for a coalition with the ANC for a number of years. Figuring out exactly where they've pulled punches in order to line this up is difficult. But I mean, I do notice that they went very soft on opportunities for seizing power of devolution in the Western Cape. That I have noticed, although I've never been able to understand exactly what the benefit of that was, because surely the more you misbehave, the more leverage you've got. The ANC's classic negotiating tactic during the early 90s was they actually increased the heat, the pressure, the violence in order to place more pressure on the NP at the negotiating table. So I sort of find it very strange that the DA haven't learned something from that and gone that path. But it might also be just quite simply that a lot of them have lived through the era of political violence, even if they weren't on the front lines of it. And so they're quite afraid of watching or of pushing the ANC too far. I think we're all aware that if push came to shove and there was any kind of interracial confrontations, that the long-term winners would not be the minorities. Even if you score some satisfying little victories at a street level, the reality is that the political establishment will not side with you. They will step back and watch you get crushed if it comes to that. So the balance of forces is not quite in our favor at the moment. So I suppose that explains why we play Pussycat. I don't know about you.
Yeah, no, absolutely, that is 100% part of it. I think any length of time in South African politics, and you will see a apparent pattern of the minorities fully understanding where they sit in the wider South African society. What we have is a sort of crystal ball into what would happen to the ANC if we made the larger black majority an enemy, for example. The result will not be some deep, like internal analysis, deep reflection of, why have racial tensions gotten so bad? It would be, oh, well, if you hate us, then we're going to hate you extra. We're going to hate you even more than we did before. So we have examples. We have the EFF and MK to look at.
Well, I think the obvious answer to the obvious way to sort of summarize that would be to say that there's no backstop to extremist ideas amongst the black population. There's no culture of a, how should I put it? There's no sort of liberal culture that sort of gets sentimental about their traditional political enemies. There's merely a calculation of, how does it affect us? Which, fair enough. It means that they don't engage in suicidally insane behavior. There's a sort of collective self-preservation element that's actually fairly sane, and that's probably our saving grace, is that a lot of the leadership, despite their language, is quite aware of what the cost would be of really implementing the programs that they've been talking about. And so we've seen a sort of great sorting of the different factions, so that the moderates, who are aware that they have to go very, very slowly or else kill the golden goose before it's finished laying its eggs, and the side that really just wants to go full Zimbabwefication just for the laughs, they've been separated from each other very cleanly. And so the possibility for a massive shake-up or a massive break has been massively reduced for the next few years. So yeah, I think we're in a very awkward position where any kind of radical long-term solutions to the situation we find ourselves in, which have structural problems that are just going to keep getting more and more fragile, none of the permanent solutions in any direction are now currently available. So we're in this kind of deadlock, and there is an optimistic view that this deadlock will just sort of solidify into a new system.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a major theme of the whole government of national unity. It seems so far to be positioning itself as a sort of political stasis chamber, just until we can figure out exactly what we actually want to do going forward. Especially the ANC, because once
That is
Cyril is
definitely
gone,
the perspective, yeah. Because I mean, you can see it in the way they talk. It's like, oh, we're going to come back. We're coming back. Whereas the DA, I think, from the way they're acting and the way that you hear Helen Zille talking when she gives public interviews, they understand this current arrangement as being the permanent new system, and it's a consociationalist vision, where the central coalition governing the country will be composed of elements of conflicting interests, who then will gradually hand over more and more power to the DA. And they see the ANC withering away and the DA forming a majority out of a cluster of small parties that they can bully and eventually then choke them to death. I mean, this is Helen Zille's perspective, really, is that you make the ANC look weak and pathetic, and you choke them out, and then you choke the small parties out, and you become the unquestionable hegemon of South Africa. But the permanency of coalition governments is something that they've accepted, because they know there's, even in the most optimistic of scenarios, a ceiling on their growth. So the odd thing that they've come up with seems to be, in a funny way, exactly what the NP were hoping would happen when they started their reforms in the 1970s, because the big popular theorist that was tapped on as an alternative was a Dutch guy called Arend Leipert. And Arend Leipert was, he came up with a system of consociationalism that based itself on the sort of the Dutch system that was based on Abraham Kuyper's observations of different communities having different cultural values and so on. And they call it the polarization system, where you funnel all of your institutions in different sectors of Dutch society where they've got a concrete, tangible culture, so that they don't have to interact with each other. They negotiate at the top. So the Protestants and the Catholics never have to butt heads. Christians and communists never have to butt heads. Liberals and trade unionists don't have to butt heads. They negotiate in Parliament, and they have these total parallel societies that hardly ever meet. They go to different schools. They read different newspapers. They attend different jobs. And it's not so much true anymore in the Netherlands, but in the mid-century it was certainly true. And Leipert looked at this and he said, well, this is the way that you deal with multi-ethnic societies: is you've got to find a way of forcing them to negotiate in the center. And the approach, and I know it's been tried in a few countries, is that you can institutionalize this by giving different regions almost a near veto in the legislature. And the approach that the old government wanted to do is to gradually break each racial group into their own parliament, which would, at the end of the day, have a veto on laws passed at the national level. But that never came to be. In the process of trying to get there, they moved too slowly. And what happened is that the compromises between the old system and the system they were trying to reach looked just like they were offering symbolic positions, the tricameral parliament and so on. So I think what we've got to now is we've got a system where everyone votes according to their own racial bloc, and then those parties negotiate at the center for those people's interests. That, at least in theory. But I think in practice, we're dealing with a problem where both parties have an agreed upon framework that descends from the United Nations, and it's going to cause a little bit of discomfort because Black South Africans are uniquely anti-globalist, and increasingly so are a lot of the white liberals in this country. Not amongst the respectable classes, but more and more amongst ordinary people. So I think there might be an opportunity for pushback in that little window. But, if the dynamic that you're describing is to be taken seriously, this should be seen actually as a risk. Once one actually challenges the stable center, you're also inviting into political discussion questions of long-term existential quality. And once that becomes at play, people start thinking, well, it's worth taking a life for this. That's the hard question. And I've been faced with this question directly regarding Cape Independence, because Cape Independence is, whether the other proponents of it want to believe it or not, it's actually an extremely radical and very dangerous idea. And I think it would be silly to pretend that it wasn't. The problem is that how do you balance the risk and how do you manage the risks? How do you conceptualize the threats that you are going to pose to political stability? And I think the obvious thing to notice is that there's not a single person who has real institutional leverage in this country who's willing to countenance any level of questioning of the fundamental nature of this country. That is just not up for debate. So this is this peculiar situation that we've come to, where the entire country is based now, its value system is based around a very strange political compromise that emerged in the early 90s, where the substance of the country is based on a lie that everyone knows is a lie, coming from both sides of the political and racial divide. So everyone knows it's a lie, but most educated people can look at this and say, yes, but if we acknowledge that it's a lie, then we have to seek other truths, and then we are in dangerous territory. So it's deeply unsatisfying, I think, to all parties who try to seek meaning in this country in any way. It's a deeply frustrating system.
Yeah,
and I think,
yeah, sorry. sorry, just
No, because again, that
yeah.
kind of thing naturally invites those questions, and yet somehow we've managed to accrue an elite that fundamentally understand that no matter how awful things get, we can't actually question the basis for the system.
Yeah, and I guess it comes down to the fact that people understand that what works almost every time works better than something that you think would work better. So any sort of like serious tampering, you've got to know like beforehand whether it's going to work or not. And when it comes to sort of high level social restructuring, there's just no way of knowing what the outcome would truly be. So any sort of altering of this system that we've implemented is going to be a gamble every single time. And what we have now is a system that has seemingly successfully sort of fended off the sort of wanting to create a ethnic-based civil war. You know,
Correct.
Zuma
They've
was
fended off the primary threat. They've fended off the very serious ethno-nationalists that were willing to turn the state violently towards their ethnic opponents. So
yes,
that's.
yeah, exactly.
But I think the really sort of annoying quality of the current administration is that it has actually accepted the moral basis for that without accepting the practical program. So it gives you a situation where, yes, we all agree that white people need to have their economic status taken down a peg or two. The DA has agreed to this by signing the statement of intent, which agrees to the ANC's transformation program. This is an enormous concession that people do not comment on very much. But what it does, it obviously the concessions that they've made allow that the ANC have made will slow down their reform program. But what they haven't done is stopped it. They've just gone a bit slow in some areas. They've radically accelerated black economic empowerment. I mean, the new wave of reforms that are coming down the pipeline in the next 12 months or so include imposing racial criteria on acquiring licenses to participate in the economy, so that it's no longer a question of, oh, well, if you're a small company, you'll scrape by. No, it's absolute participation. Like, you will not get into the economy and be able to operate. You'll not be able to use water. You'll not be able to have a medical license if your organization is not sufficiently black. And then they can just ratchet up and the DA are not even criticizing this. They're not even talking about it. And this is shocking. I mean, this is the kind of thing where you're now in the territory that the Dutch found themselves in Indonesia, and somehow we are now in the territory where it is sort of going to raise questions like, do you act outside the system? And yet nobody's willing to press that button.
Yeah. I think these sorts of things don't happen as an instance and then a follow through. It's almost a cultural shift, right, for these sorts of things to become possible. Like in the US, for example, there have been lots of assassinations or attempted assassinations on presidents, but it's a cultural shift towards seeing the other side as a target that makes it something that you can just openly defend, right? You can openly defend trying to assassinate Donald Trump. You can openly say that you don't care if Trump supporters got mowed down at a rally or whatever, because that's something that's been building up for, arguably decades.
It's not so true anymore. I think what has happened now is that there's been a lot of cold water thrown on the public commentariat. They're actually starting to properly cancel people off digital platforms and so on. The CNN even did. There's that guy Morning Joe, who's a bit nuts, pro-Democrat. Center left vibe, but completely insane in terms of how in terms of like the pragmatics of politics. They were pulled off. That show was pulled off the air the day after the shooting, not because he's actually said anything, but because they were worried he might say something. So there's a unique window at the moment that the right has tried to pounce upon, but I haven't seen a lot of fruits developing of this. They have gone after a number of people for calling for Donald Trump's assassination or celebrating it or so on. And it's been, I think they're starting to see the limits of their capacity to express violent intent. But I suspect they're not going to be able to put it away for very long.
Yeah, this would be my concern as well. I do see a lot of the gunning for the people who have been the worst in terms of this sort of rhetoric in America, but I think it's a sort of product of the momentary, incredibly high political energy that the right is enjoying post Trump getting shot hard.
Because if you wanted to see change, because if you wanted to see change, you'd have to see people expressing contrition. They'd have to say like, I'm sorry that we should reel ourselves back in. It has to come from inside the left. That's not happening. That's not happening as far as I can tell. And so I don't think that America is going to cool down for very long. I think that they're going to go back to being edgy buggers as they were. And I think the difference is that they're going to feel that the right has power now. And it remains to be seen what sort of personality the current left in America are really made of, because their political support base is a fantastic piece by Freddie de Boer, who's a Marxist, but not a retard. A rare example of such. But he was commenting on the way that, left liberals in America, who can be very edgy in their own right, the way that they remember their excesses, for example, during the George Floyd protests and all of that. And he talks about things like the progressive stack and, the weirdest parts of racial, identity grievance culture and so on. And it says, well, these are actually reactionary liberal perspectives, whereas a true progressive perspective focuses on economic factors and so on. Very typical Marxist take, which is not, if you share his worldview, this is an accurate take on things. But I think he what he was noticing is that there's a distinct irritation that people on the left take when one of their own says, hey, can we have a serious look at where we've gone wrong? And it doesn't matter how you frame the critique. There's a sort of deep psychological resistance to actual self-criticism. When you look at the early communists, like in Russia or so on, despite the extraordinarily draconian political system they were in, they were still capable of actually having serious discussions about the direction that their national policy was taking, about the direction that their national ideology was taking. And there were actual very serious policy reversals on major meaningful questions, whether you're talking about how they implemented how they implemented the processes for policing the intelligentsia. You saw that reversal after Khrushchev took over from Stalin, but even during Stalin's reign, you see this pivot from anti-religion to pro-religion during the Second World War, and then back to an anti-Christian system again. I mean, But Lenin, for example, Lenin had this thing where he pushed forth a sexual revolution early on, and when it turned into a lot of trouble and severe social malaise, they ended it. They went back to, okay, traditional social roles, men and women. Yes, we'll continue, allowing abortions and things like that, but let's soft pedal the free love and promiscuity stuff. That kind of thing, those kind of pivots are things that the left in the West as a whole don't seem really all that good at anymore. And you hear talks amongst the dissident right in some corners, particularly the British lot, about the establishment putting the woke away. And that for me is an interesting observation, because I do see a bit of it, but it's not coming from within the left. The left continues to be ungovernable. And I think an interesting time has come where there's a massive domination of the UK by the left. And they're in a position where they've had to recruit a huge number of people for MPs. They don't necessarily know how to vet. Some of those candidates who are in some cases just paper candidates who are put there to run, won in unexpected ways. And so now you've got this huge parliamentary position that has a lot of people in there who are quite radical and won't necessarily be able to be controlled. And this attempt by the centre to moderate the Labour Party, they've purged a lot of the Corbynites. Yes, they have. But they haven't completely put away the left. And these sort of far left agitators within the party, like the coalition, the group known as Hope Not Hate, they're still around. They're still, banging about the place and having institutional influence. And I haven't had the time to look at this in fine-grained detail. So I'm having to take a lot of this second-hand and from reading superficial details because, this is a foreign country. I only have so much bandwidth. I barely have time to cover the whole of South Africa. But it strikes me that just as an sort of an empirical experiment as to whether one can actually put a lid on what's going on the left, the UK is the one to watch. The UK is definitely the one to watch. I mean, Spain is an example as well, but again, on the continent, things work slightly differently. There are established systems of patronage that are way deeper and more sclerotic than you find in the Anglosphere. So it remains to be seen. So, and I don't understand the Spanish political system too well. So there's not much I could really glean from that without giving it a real deep dive. With the UK, though, I think that's a good observation because they share so much in common with the American left, the UK left do. And they have way deeper institutional influence. So the real question is just, are they capable of containing their extremists? They might be capable to some extent, but I don't think it's ever going away. And one must remember that Jeremy Corbyn, when he ran for government, scored, I think, 1 million more votes than Starmer did in this current election. It's not a small margin.
A higher share of the vote as well, from my understanding.
Higher share as well. It's entirely due to the Conservatives being split by Reform that we have the situation we have up there. So it remains to be seen what can happen. The Labour coalition might be more fragile and febrile than they're given credit for at the moment. There's a lot of celebrations going on. I think that might prove to be more fragile than they thought. But I think in America, what they're really just falling apart. They can't coordinate anymore, and the things that you're seeing right now, where Biden was gotten rid of clearly by one of his staffers while he's incommunicado, that kind of behavior, that where they can't even find a likable candidate that the party itself earnestly supports. It's just that nobody wants to run now. Everyone's scared.
It's
an enormous coordination problem. I mean, how do you reallocate the war chest? The donations that you put into these presidential campaigns. You can't simply swap out a candidate. So there are restrictions on what they can physically do. So they're going to have to find a way of making sure that Kamala Harris, one way or another, becomes completely compliant while becoming, it's the idea of, assuming that they do win, how would you even control a nutbag like that?
This is a big problem for the Democrats because, truthfully, I'm not like obsessed with US politics like it seems that most people in South Africa are, but I have followed close enough over the years to sort of realize that the Democrats have never really moved past that 2008 election win. They've really been hanging off the coattails of Obama's initial gust of unity. Every candidate has been part of the Obama, either merged into the Obama faction, like with Hillary, after initially being his direct opposition, or was, literally the vice president under Obama. And I think the Democrats
makes sense from another perspective, because Obama created a new narrative of what unity means in America. So before him, because with George Bush, there was, if you look back at the way that they tried to pitch unity, it's like this trying to be approachable to both sides and saying, okay, you're my opponents, but we're still in this together. Bill Clinton, even though he could be vindictive to the other side, there was a sense of rapprochement. Obama really ended that once and for all. And
Obama South Africa. Obama would fit in well in South Africa. He fully believed in creating ethnic and political line, or geographic lines rather, because it's mainly revolving around where you live, and sort of cobbling together a coalition of people who will be loyal to you, rather than trying to engage in like something more bridge building with the other side.
Well, it's funny because it also depends on how your party's structured. So, the ANC is very factional. And so in some ways, it's very similar to the Democratic Party, where you have all of these little groups that lobby and scream for position. And even if you kind of lose a policy battle, you can gain a lot of clout by demonstrating that you have support. And the same thing happens in the ANC, just a little bit differently. If you can show that you can put people on the street and disrupt public process, you show that you've got power. So this is how a lot of people negotiate in the ANC. But the DA is different. The DA in some ways is actually more like the Republican Party in the US, in that if somebody with enough influence as a leader comes into power in the party, they reshape all of the internal discussions. So that kind of difference in structural behavior is very instructive, because what's interesting about the DA is because there's such a tiny pool of donors in the country, in South Africa, there isn't actually room for people of great difference to leverage change within the DA. You are going to have a very narrow clique of people who are capable of making their way into the upper echelons of the DA. They have to be able to network with the permanent oligarchs, the old families who run the country. This creates a sort of narrowing effect. I think Mmusi Maimane, it's funny that the Mmusi Maimane modeled his campaign after Barack Obama. It was, the strangest thing is that they still had the same campaign strategist then as they did for the last election, and indeed for the first election where they gained serious support, which is back in 2000. This guy called Gregory Krumbok. And Krumbok, his parents are German, and they moved him to South Africa when he was a little sprog. But he's proven to be like the big campaign organizer, the genius behind it. And he retired after this election. So there's a very strange, how should I put it, degree of suspense over what's going to happen in the DA. They've lost the one person that coordinated all of their public strategies, and so now how they're going to operate in public it's hard to predict. I mean, how are they going to handle the local elections in a couple of years? The character of the people in charge, when I listen to people who are close, and I have one or two contacts who can speak to me about what's going on to some degree, when you hear about the way that people actually play for power in the DA, how they handle the admin, how they handle corruption, how they handle their critics, you see a completely different picture to what is portrayed in the media, what's portrayed in public communications. There's the picture in public is of like these smiling optimists who are just squeaky clean, good old boy, good old scouts honor, blah, blah, blah. And the reality behind that is a lot of very bitter, cynical, old thugs. In some respects, I mean, look, you kind of have to be a politician. It's not the end of the world if you have a thuggish streak. You do need one to survive in South Africa. But how are you going to be able to contain that picture going forward? I think the consolidation of News 24 is helping the matters because they're friendly to the DA. They're heavily behind the current coalition. They dominate the media landscape, and you've really only got two major sources of information for news in South Africa. You've got News 24 and you've got IOL. And then, of course, you've got like the state broadcaster and ENCA, but, they fall in the same category as IOL. They're all ANC mouthpieces. And News 24 is DA plus Ramaphosa kind of mouthpiece. It's like this very specific byline that they're pitching. So I think that at this point, the DA are going to have to rely on the instincts of the media class to represent them pretty much on their own, which, are they going to be able to move adequately? Are the DA going to be able to communicate in a way that anticipates that environment without the help of a serious coordinator? That remains to be seen. I know that they are benefiting from some very, very, very skillful PR managers, like the lady who manages Jordan Hill Lewis. She's managed to convince everyone that it's not the quality of the civil service in the city of Cape Town, but the presence of clean-shaven young Santa Claus over there, who has somehow managed to magic Cape Town into the best city in the universe. I mean, this is a guy who for 4 years just completely overlooked one of the most massive and deadly corrupt relationships in the country, right under his nose. I mean, the Malusi boy story, right? I mean, it's currently playing out. There was another assassination of a city councillor over the property contracts, construction contracts with the gangs, and all of those assassinations are downstream of the loss of their sort of compliant contact, Malusi boy. Because now that Malusi boy is out of the picture, I mean, he was caught with his hands in the till very badly, and the party only admitted to it once his office was raided. But now we've got this thing spilling out a little bit more because the numbers gangs are being rejected, and when they're rejected, they threaten to kill people. And it's funny, I mean, that ties us back to the theme that you're pointing out, is that when you look at real political violence and people who are dying, it's related to looting. It's not, there aren't bigger ideas at play. There aren't people who are running out and saying, well, I believe in this and therefore these people should die. They're sort of, we don't even see terrorism here. We really don't. We don't see political terrorism. We see criminal violence that is related to political patronage. So obviously a lot of the stuff that goes on in KwaZulu-Natal, and the shooting of whistleblowers and so on. But yeah, I think that the real problem will be emerging now is when you see the DA having to deal with local government issues, where those kind of corrupt issues and those kind of violent issues are starting to be a little bit more visible. And I'm trying my best to expose some of them, but I can't keep a fixed eye on all of them. I've managed to pick up a few things from the Garden Route, some from my own municipality, some from George, but in the long run, what we're struggling with is, how should I put this? What we really struggle with is actually a lack of real political competition, and the dynamic that you bring up, where people are not willing to entertain. They're not willing to go there. They're not willing to go towards the existential questions. That is part of the problem. So I think it's a double-edged sword, because in America, at the moment, they're dealing with they're wrestling with real questions of, what does their republic mean? What does it mean to be American? What are we for? Who are we for? Who is American? They are like really profound questions. Whereas we have decided, at the point where those questions were being seriously discussed by all of the intelligentsia at the most maximum intensity they had been since the 90s, we decided, forget about that. We don't want to know. We don't want to know who we are. We don't want to know what we're for. We just want to get on with our lives and let whoever happens to be in charge decide whatever they want for us. And no one really wants to scratch and ask. No one wants to know what's under that shiny new veneer. And that's the funny thing. You see what I'm going with this? It's like I suspect that there's actually some value to be had in starting to play with those dangerous questions. The problem is that it also comes at a massive price. It comes at a very awful price.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll point out in the article that when the ANC did sort of start engaging in this, obviously from their perspective, which is something that we are all shit scared of for the most part. Malema became ANC youth leader in 2008, then was immediately followed by Zuma in 2009, and they immediately started the ANC's media machine. Kill the Boer, or its variations, started coming up in all of the ANC congregations, or at least a lot of the big ones, especially. The white monopoly capital conspiracy theory started up. I mean, this was the time of Bell Pottinger, right? These things don't exist coincidentally for no reason, right? It was a very obvious concerted effort to really up the temperature and start having that conversation in a way that very clearly framed minorities as being not part of the equation for South Africa. And I think I think the DA, because they understand that they're not actually a political threat to the ANC, and the ANC understands that the DA is not actually a threat to them, they never they never took the bait in that regard. They gave up what is a very powerful rhetorical tool, and they decided that they'd rather go for a long-term aim in this regard.
Well, I think, look, they've been around since 1912. They know how to wait. But I think at the same time, there's a balance of forces calculation, because if you read ANC documents, this is always how they think of everything. What are the balance of forces? And there is increasing talk nowadays about the international balance of forces rather than the local one. So until recently, there's been talk about, how far have we advanced in black ownership of the private economy? How far have we advanced in black ownership of land? How far have we advanced in black penetration of the various institutions? But now there's this big discussion where, I mean, Sherbet, the one big strategy document they published a couple of years ago under Ramaphosa actually said, well, we don't have to worry about organizing in the streets anymore. Who cares about that? We need to focus on the middle class and, how to get them behind us. This is a very interesting perspective. I'm not sure they actually delivered on that, but it's an interesting change. So that they have realized that, well, most people are apathetic. They accept the system. All we have to do is make sure that we can complete the program. So they survive long enough to finish their objective, which is to completely transform South Africa into a black national socialist system. But what happened when they started going after Israel and siding with Russia and so on, the response from a public perspective was very tepid. But if you're paying attention at the time, the little rebukes they got from the United States did result in changes of behavior. And I think once more, we're seeing the United States sort of gently tighten the screws, because now they're going in for renegotiating the AGOA treaties, the trade exemptions that they've got with us. Now, that raised a couple of questions for me. So, like, what exactly are they angling for by trying to have those renegotiated? And I cannot see a very clear angle. I suspect it might be just to put pressure on them to make sure that they are shelving some of the reforms that Ramaphosa put on the conveyor belt during his first term. But I'm not sure, because clearly if they were
sort of rewarding mechanism for siding with the DA in the end.
It might be. But I'm sort of looking at a couple of other developments that are not being trumpeted about a lot, which is like the Saudis deciding that they are no longer sticking by the petrodollar arrangement and they're going to start bilateral financial trades of oil. That means that the dollar is going to, over the next few years, rapidly lose its leverage. The Fed is going to lose its capacity to print money without consideration. And we're already starting to see, the slow bursting of a very, very long bubble that's been going on for about 40 years, which means that America's ability to leverage power on the international stage is now officially waning. And I think that South Africa, the way that the ANC has been reacting to this, if you follow some of the comments from people in their sphere, in the intellectual sphere, is they're saying, well, now China's rising. So surely at some point in the near future, we're going to be able to put our foot on the accelerator again. But the time is obviously not now. So the question is then when? And how do they see this coming down the pipeline? How do they see this actual pathway to implementing their viewpoint or not? Because if they lose the revolutionary momentum, as I think they've lost a lot of it, they won't be able to survive. And in order to get the government functioning, the DA has sort of gone down the route of saying, well, it would be enormously destabilizing if we imposed any kind of austerity program on South Africa. So we're going to have to try and save money by cutting corruption. And from my perspective, that doesn't seem to work, because the DA actually hasn't got any internal discipline for getting rid of corruption in their own ranks. Not that their corruption is worse than the ANC's, it certainly isn't. But they don't deal with corruption in their party by punishing anyone. They do it by promoting them, right? So Malusi Boy, case in point, Conrad Pool, they have a major corruption scandal, and then quickly they're bundled out of that constituency and put on the parliamentary list. So we can look at that kind of thing and think, Okay, so how are they actually going to negotiate problems with, their own kind getting into bed with ANC ministers and making money and getting involved in compromised decision making and so on? How are they going to deal with it? Well, we already see this with Cyril Ramaphosa, where the John Steenhuisen states openly now, okay, we are not taking care, or we are not going to go after Cyril Ramaphosa for Pala Pala. And Helen Sillows made a very clever sort of non-answer when she was asked this directly. She says, well, we want a commission of inquiry, and only after that he has been prosecuted will we consider an impeachment process. Now, if you've been paying attention to how long these things take 5 years, 6 years, 7 years before they get to the point that you can actually prosecute anyone, even the smallest of fish in any given situation. So what she's really saying is that, no, we will never, ever touch Cyril Ramaphosa. Now, there are practical reasons for this. Obviously, we know why. It's not, we can't sort of pretend, we should have naively expected her to immediately stab Cyril in the face in public. But, that's not politically mature. Obviously, that can't happen. But I think, that situation is going to radically undermine their capacity to get anything done. And I think that is going to make them a captive instrument of the ANC over time. And the balance of forces equation, it means that the ANC have actually got a shield, because any Western government that comes and says, actually, well, what's going on in your country? And the DA said, no, it's fine. We've got it under control. Don't worry about us. Right?
And the DA has no capacity to determine what follows Cyril. Right? Every single president.
That's not true. There is a play that they can make. So, first challenge of the ANC dealing with their massive electoral losses is, how do you contain the DA and make sure that they're not a serious threat? The second one is, how do you get, they've done that. Second one is, how do you get rid of the black radicals? Well, with Zuma, you just wait for him to die. With the EFF, you prosecute them for their corruption in the VBS scandal. That's already underway. So the third challenge is, how do you deal with internal challenges in the ANC, right? Because if Ramaphosa goes after Paul Mashatile directly himself using state instruments or what have you, then immediately you get the Zuma effect. Now, Ramaphosa is not going to make the same mistake his predecessor made, and his predecessor before him, right? You attack your deputy and you absolutely disrupt the whole scenario, because everyone can smell what's going on. So I think the play at the moment, and I suspect that I've heard people tell me this, but I believe it, is that what the DA, what Ramaphosa is going to do is he's going to stand aside and let the DA do it, so that the DA goes after Paul Mashatile and sort of says, wow, we found this really disturbing, information about this and this relationship with that and that person. Then it's very difficult for Paul Mashatile to defend himself in a way that curries favor within his party. It's very difficult. And Ramaphosa can say, hey, we were letting it take its course. I can't do anything. And Kaya Sithole pointed something interesting out, that might play into our favor for sort of mid-level corruption as well, in that the ANC often protects their own kind, but now that it's something that is relatively bipartisan, they kind of say, hey, I'm sorry, but with the DA in this and that position, we can't act like this anymore. We're not in control. We can't let you go leave jail on medical anymore. I'm sorry, it's we're not in charge of correctional facilities anymore. So Kaya Sithole, you made a very interesting point there. But I think what that's going to be used for is factional control, because the DA are not naive and they know which players in the ANC are friendly with the EFF and MK and which are not, and they will not allow those factions to gain control. So, from my perspective, it's the real question is A, will the DA win that battle? And B, once they've won that battle, will the ANC actually keep them around? Because once you've gotten to the point that the DA have outlived their usefulness and there's no opposition, to your left, you can grow again. If the DA perform well in government, so do the ANC. They come out and they say, "Listen, guys, we pulled together and we fixed this, and this is my this is my legacy. So Ramaphosa, vote ANC." You're gonna get a few people coming back to the fold, especially if on his way out he manages to start pushing the radical agenda again. So if he survives past 2027 and he manages to stick a few depth charges into the policy world, into the policy treadmill, he can actually bring back some of the black radicals again under a stable system, under a stable party system. So it depends entirely on what you actually think his personal agenda is. It depends what you think his, strategic powers are. So if the DA can't dislodge Paul Mashatile, there's no way for Ramaphosa to do it. I mean, he can try, but I suspect that would backfire. So, but we'll know all of this within 2-3 years. Probably even know what's happening by the time local elections roll around.
Yeah, we won't have to wait too long. But even if it is someone more friendly to the DA, or someone more friendly rather to, or more adverse to the particularly radical politics, every single ANC president has brought in not only their own sort of vision for how the country should run, they've also brought in this whole new narrative around South African politics and like what our collective goal is supposed to be, right? Like Mandela, it was very simple, right? He was selling a vision of putting together a unified state of South Africa. It was very basic, truthfully, creating equal rights for everyone, not super complicated concepts. But in addition to that, he focused on the whole reconciliation, building the bridges, trying to remove that hostility. And Mbeki sort of shifted from that. He was more into this whole sort of bringing together this African identity and this relationship with Africa.
It's building an African elite. That was his number thing. It's like, and you can watch it. You can read it in the policy documents. It's everyone sort of says, growth and redistribution. This is Thatcherite nonsense. No. So it's actually Fabian, and and he actually used the term "the third way" to sell his policy when he moved overseas. He wasn't ignorant of this. It wasn't sort of a coincidence. So he understood the Fabian model. And he pushed this idea of building an elite that meshed with government policy. And he did this by, enforcing the BEE system and trimming a lot of government spending that would have, not in absolute terms, but he reduced the mechanisms by which it would expand. He also made a lot of room for. He also made a lot of room for taking advantage of, as Chris Waldberger points out, taking advantage of the commodity cycle. He made life very easy for the mining sector. He made life very easy for for European car manufacturers, European arms manufacturers. So he grew this sort of base upon which the ANC's elite allies could make a lot of money. But in the ANC policy documents, what they talk about is creating an economic elite that can actually have an effect, because one of the biggest competitions, especially during the Mandela era, is this fairly solid white private sector that absolutely dominates. It was more than 80% ownership of the private sector, something like 85% of the private sector is white owned, and you've got a situation where if the ANC make a move that's too radical, the private sector says, "Oh, well, you don't like that? We'll divest. We'll screw you." And so there's a lot of talk about the markets, the sensitivity, that balance of forces. Mbeki basically ended that, and Zuma created patronage networks. What he was about was shoring up patronage networks, and in a funny sort of way, he returned to tradition in a sense, because Mbeki's idea of the African Renaissance is not one in which you actually promote African culture. It's you promote black power by building the elite. Whereas Zuma's position is saying, no. We've got to return. We've created this elite. We've got to bring them back down to re-Africanize them. And so he promotes traditional governance. He promotes this tripartite neo-patrimonialism between traditional governance, unions, and parties that control the private sector through a triangulated relationship. That's what gets you to Marikana. That's what gets you to the situation where you have this static relationship. And Ramaphosa helped build this even before Zuma came to the presidency. It was his union that blocked the wildcat strikes in the Platinum Belt. That burst out into violence. That created the situation where only by illegally striking could they gain access to bargaining in that sector. And then now you're reaching a situation where the unions are increasingly losing their power because they no longer have educated and sound representatives in the bargaining councils. You watch them fall apart. The only bargaining deals that they can strike, which are favorable to them, are when a sectoral cartel finds it advantageous to lock out their small and medium-sized enterprise competition, as they did recently in the aluminium and steel sector last year. I think what you're looking at here is a situation where for Zuma, he felt that we were already in a position that we could consolidate, and I think he didn't feel a sense of urgency on the big land questions and so on. I think he felt, we've arrived, okay, we are already here, we're living the fat life, let's have some fun, and let's help out our families, And so there's this whole reaching back into the traditional sector where they go, where they sort of go, well, these are our brothers, let's help them out. But I think an interesting perspective on Zuma is that he started taking seriously means for chipping away at the colored support for the DA and destroying the IFP. And the way he did that was through these traditional councils. I think that by gaining the following, by giving additional powers, and some of these powers are extraordinary. They have some powers of summons, so they can function like they can function a lot like judges. They have a lot of the powers that the judges do. So that if they wish to start a legal proceedings against someone under customary law, they have powers of summons. They can send a bailiff or a sheriff to go and retrieve the person. These are fairly serious powers, right? Great, because of this, the existence of the modern state. These are greater powers than they actually had in pre-modern conditions. So, he cut the IFP right in half. Their support went to less than 50% of what it was before he came in. And I think in a way he actually triggered what we now see as the awakening of the Khoisan identity movement, because they're all over the place, these groups, who are jockeying for recognition from Cogta, right? I mean, I've had a little bit of contact with the local Kochokwa group, and they've been looking for recognition themselves, right? And there's this bizarre thing where they don't have any sort of sense of building their own environment, like the Afrikaners would. It's all about can the state recognize us? Can we get a piece of the pie? So it's not a small impact. It's actually changed the way that whole communities negotiate for power, and I'm still struggling to put how should I put it? Give a good framework for what Ramaphosa has been doing, because on the one hand, it looks like he's trying to appease international establishment perspectives on things like green energy policy and human rights and LGBTQ and all of that. And on the other hand, you see him appeasing the Communist Party and a lot, which is strange because the Communist Party should be easy to ignore. And at the same time, he does a lot of appeasing of big, powerful business groups. And it seems that everybody who talks to him comes away thinking that they've gotten what they wanted from him. And that's been the case.
His history as being a negotiator, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, but then the question is, what is he negotiating for?
His own survival, for the most part. That's sort of the impression I get from him.
Yeah, you've got to wonder, because he could have very easily in 2017, he could have said, actually, I don't want it. I'm fabulously wealthy. Leave me alone. But I mean, someone who addresses his dad in an act of defiance at the age of 16 and says, I'm going to become president of South Africa. That under apartheid, no less. That kind of thing that's not a dream you forget. So I suppose he sort of shot himself in the foot a little bit, in a way. Forced himself to go into a position where he'd have to negotiate for Lord knows what.
Yeah, Cyril is a bit of a puzzling figure in South African politics, because he was so integral to the transition period. And then he was sort of shoring himself up to become president during the Mandela administration.
Yes, when him and Sefale tried to take a swing at Mbeki and displace him before, and then failed.
Yeah, Mbeki quickly got rid of him. Ramaphosa dipped out of the political scene up until basically when he was appointed VP. I don't recall him being too heavily involved in the ANC before that at that point.
Yeah,
and he sort of just spent his time sort of working with the government, as in taking tenders and whatnot, become fabulously wealthy. And I guess he's now trying to solidify a political legacy.
Yeah, I think legacy is probably fair at this point, because for the last 5 years he's been playing a game of survival. But my big question is, what are they going to do about things like NHI? So you can see a lot of people jockeying to try and water it down, but I can't see a way of watering it down. They'd have to defeat it in the courts. They'd have to find a way of letting it be defeated in the courts, or this whole country is going to go belly up before he's done with his term. Unless they're hoping to kick the can down the road until the next guy's in charge. I mean, let's say it's Ronald Lamola who comes in charge of this and watches the entire health sector disintegrating across the country. I mean, what is that going to look like? I can't imagine, even if they persist in the current coalition agreement, that the DA are going to be able to survive that. I think that, if the NHI comes close to implementation anywhere near an election, the DA will be absolutely permanently wiped out, like NNP style wipeout.
Yeah, I think for the particularly frightening thing about the NHR is that the way that it would be structured, if it was to be implemented, would make it almost impossible for it to be quickly dismantled, right? Because you would have a shared pool of the money essentially. And I think we can all recognize the fact that when it comes to shared pool of money, money, it becomes very difficult to sort of untangle that sort of.
Yeah, and I mean, if you think about how it combines with the way that they're extending the third wave of BEE, with you make license as a prerequisite for owning certain kinds of businesses, for engaging in certain kinds of practices, you now have a situation where only people who have privileged access are capable of even participating as a client of this new fund, and the looting opportunities are absolutely extraordinary. I mean, forget implementation, which yeah, I mean, how do you implement something like this where you're going to decide for every citizen which doctor they are and are not allowed to see? I mean, that kind of granular detail is going to make it. If anyone who's ever tried to deal with any aspect of South African bureaucracy, they're going to have to place like the most efficient DA, clock cleaner in charge of that. And
Yeah, well, this is where non-compliance should be the result, right? If the private sector in South Africa ever grows some balls, they will recognize that the slow boil has reached its tipping point at this. You can't have a situation
I think the
where
thing is they're locked in now. They're locked in now.
they need to figure out how to become unlocked like this.
There's no way for the private sector to move anymore. I think that the effects of BEE have made shared ownership inextricable, and those shares are tied very closely to the ANC's power structure. I think there's also a problem of divestment. A lot of companies could try and divest a fair amount, but they can't. It's difficult for them to leverage that because they can't completely remove the company, any of the companies from the country completely. It's stuck behind. So it would be a case of like under the old regime when the embargo was in place, you start having companies divest their shares in South Africa, and who scoops it up? Well, the legacy oligarchs, and in this case, it's going to be people like Patrice Motsepe, who are going to be able to gobble up whatever's divested very, very quickly. So then, I think when push comes to shove, the only the calculation they're going to be really making that allows them to push buttons like that is either the horse is already bolted, in which case screw it, or they can secure special trade deals with China, which allows them to act with greater freedom because they'll have some kind of economic insurance. So those are the two situations I would have to. I think you should watch out for, because if the NHI sort of comes through, gets implemented, there's no way to reverse it. Then the ANC decide, oh, well, everything's going to pieces, might as well take mine. And if it doesn't come to pass, they can make a whole bunch of really exotic moves once China has gained the position that it's destined for in the international world order. So it's really a question of whether the US can penetrate our market sufficiently, deepen its penetration of our market over the next few years. So I have a sort of ambivalent position on this, in that if the US manages to move smartly and punish the ANC in ways that it can feel immediately or threaten credibly without acting, because that's actually what you want, is a credible threat that is not acted upon. then they can get the ANC to roll back on some of their potential reforms. But if they can't do that, then what it really does is it just rapidly pushes the country into the hands of the Eastern Alliance and gives them way more room to maneuver.
Yeah, and well, in terms of the horse already being bolted in, one particularly scary occurrence that I've been told is happening in South Africa is that the major, especially industrial investments that have occurred in South Africa over the years are still present. They're still there, sort of doing their job, but it's a case of the investments that should have been made to continue these operations and continue the growth path that these operations are normally supposed to be on is not present. So as a result, the manufacturing sector in South Africa is riddled of these cases of almost skeleton operations. The multinational investors have these things going on, have these factories and whatnot operating in such a way so as to operate at the absolute minimum, not just cost, but minimum level of investment necessary. And they are trying to essentially produce for the South African economy without sort of getting too heavily involved. So instead of building like
I
instead
know, I
of
know what you're
yeah
saying. I know what you're saying. So, I mean, you can look at ArcelorMittal. So they threatened to pull entirely out of the country at the beginning of this year. I am honestly not sure what concessions they got from the government that reassured them that they ought to stay. Might have something to do with the new government arrangement. It might not, but they hung about, and yet a lot of other companies, like mines, a huge number of small and medium sized enterprises closed their doors. So you have this situation where the state is quite aware that the bit of manufacturing that we got is under a lot of threat. Because look, ArcelorMittal has one of our last remaining steelworks, and they're the only ones that makes long steel. So eye bars and things like that. So that we don't have a lot to play with, and the ANC, being Marxist in nature, sort of has a instinctive understanding that that kind of heavy industry is something you can't do without. They said goodbye to some car manufacturers without too much fanfare, but I think that one probably put a little bit of fear in them.
yeah it's it's a difficult situation because typically parties like the ANC are big into the sort of industrial manufacturing sort of framework for growing the economy, right? It's something very simple to wrap your head around, and it's something that's very scalable, right? If you want jobs, you just build a factory. People generally need things to be produced, so build a factory and get those people working. It generates economic activity, it puts money into people's pockets, it gets them adding value to the system. But I, I don't know what sort of ideological gymnastics have occurred within the ANC. They've decided that industry is something to be hostile to, and they've decided that they will at best be sort of ambivalent towards the private industry in South Africa. They won't, at best, they won't get involved too heavily. They'll let the trade unions do all of the mucking up of things instead. But
Yeah.
it's totally bizarre for what you would expect a country that has nearly 40% unemployment rate.
No, but I mean, remember that they actually celebrate this. I have a curious suspicion that they actually follow some of the talks that are being had at places like the World Economic Forum and so on. I remember some years ago, I had a friend in the ANC. We're not friends anymore, but I remember way back in 2016, 2017, he was talking about the fourth industrial revolution. At the time, I had no idea what the hell that was. I wasn't following that kind of stuff. I was sort of head in the sand, slowly leaving Marxism behind and so on. I wasn't paying attention to World Economic Forum stuff or anything. And this friend of mine, the particular things that he was pointing towards suggest that there is, because I mean he had an internship at the time with Bladen Zimande's office, so it's not like he was a nobody in the party. Although he didn't really convert his opportunities into a career with the party very much. I think he works for some international NGO now. But the things he was pointing at suggest to me that the way that the ANC talks about their unemployment rate, where they say, oh, look how many people we've put on welfare, look how many dependents we've created, it's not actually as insane as most of their liberal critics say. I think they're actually looking at it in terms of, well, look, these people are going to be made obsolete in a few years anyway. So we need to actually have this in place to make sure that people don't rebel, that they don't destabilize the system. So this is what I suspect is going on, is that they understand it as a pacification mechanism and don't worry too much about the structural effects that it has, because they figure that there will be this wealth creation that will come down the pipeline, this enormous welter of cheap technology that will eventually mean that all of the old questions about maximizing employment become obsolete. And the only question that you have to resolve then is, how do you occupy the useless? So, I mean, these are the kind of things that you hear Yuval Harari talking about, results of mass automation and so on. So I think that we have a peculiar problem on our hands, in that I think the ANC does actually know how to talk to the global elite in their own language. I suspect that, because one of the other elements that I notice is, so Ronald Lamola is a very old, they're the one who, many say are being lined up to replace Ramaphosa in the event that they manage to get rid of Mashatile. He's very close in with the World Economic Forum. Ramaphosa himself and Kuben Naidu of the South African Reserve Bank were recruited by a foreign subsidiary of the Fabian Society known as Common Purpose back in 1999. So they have ties to these very particular schools of public management and so on. I think that what we're looking at is a situation where they have the capacity to survive critical debates about South Africa's future in amongst the Western left, not only because of the legacy that they inherit from apartheid, all of this idea of South Africa as a model multiracial society that serves as a model for the Western world in futures to come, but also that they can kind of reassure them that they are the people to be at the steering wheel for the society, and not some other kind of arrangement. And what frustrates me a great deal is that the DA has given this argument a second wind, because once you have the DA in place and they're happily sharing power with the ANC, despite all of these supposed differences, you've got a very concrete answer to the question, well, can the black man and white man dream the same dream? All of those old cliches. I think that right now, international confidence in South Africa is at an all-time high. Confidence within Europe is at an all-time low. Security in America's future is crazy. No one knows what's going to happen. And so, in a funny sort of way, South Africa, being a country with Western enclaves and a recognizably Western legible political and economic system is a place which will become increasingly attractive in the next few years while the DA still remains in charge. And I think this is a reason both to be optimistic and cautious, because it means that the quality of life can rise significantly for all parties. So that's a good thing. On the other hand, it serves as a mask for any kind of reforms, a hide for any kind of ANC reforms that they may want to sneak past. So this is the paradox I sit with. This is the paradox I sit with. It's, how do you realistically approach both of those aspects of the current arrangement such that you don't end up being some kind of deranged system smasher for its own sake? Because there is a necessity to approach serious radical questions, but you also don't want to rock the boat in a way that is suicidal. You don't want to capsize unless you've got a life jacket. And I think at the moment nobody really has life jackets, and it's very difficult to convince anyone to put them on when the boat isn't rocking. So it's a chicken and egg situation. Remains to be seen what Solidarity will do about it.
Yeah, it's I can't remember whether it was in a conversation or whether I just saw a tweet about it or whatever, but someone essentially posited that South Africa is a national level experiment to see whether you can create a highly productive 20% of the population that's incredibly well integrated into the global elite, and use that as a mechanism to fund a sort of, I don't know what you would call it, basic
proletariat.
Yeah, essentially. So
I do see that as well. I mean, I still remember this strange comment by Nick Land from back in 1989 when he was writing Fang Numina. If you open that book in the first chapter, the title is so bizarre that you wouldn't expect him to mention anything like geopolitics. But I mean, I think it's called like Kantian logic and incest or something peculiar like that. Okay. But then the chapter opens by saying, well, South Africa is the world recapitulated in miniature, with this white metropole and a black colonial hinterland. And then he talks about the relationship where they're trying to separate, capital from labor in the same territory. And then he says, well, okay, but you've got this global system in which the same thing is happening. You're having the West offshore their jobs while opening doors to immigration. And it's only at the very beginning of those trends internationally. So what's really peculiar is that he notices this system, and this guy is not amongst the elite. He's a very, very eccentric intellectual outsider at the time. So the idea that he's the only person that noticed that parallel is absurd. Of course, everyone else has noticed. South Africa is much like a model of the world. You've got this tiny minority of wealthy whites who have, at the time of writing, who control the economy unequivocally, and they have this dependent mass that who they rely on for cheap labor in order to function. And now we've got a situation where, well, you've got the cheap labor, but because they're included in the political system, they have to be pacified. So the West is starting to look at automation, and they think, well, okay, well, it's a similar situation. And with mass migration, they say, well, how do you contain the reactionary populism of the productive classes? It's a very peculiar set of questions, and the weird thing is that the analogy breaks down once you start to ask what happened, break up South Africa, because now you're entering political competition again, and what does the West look like if it takes a similar result, a similar answer? Very difficult, very violent, very ugly ends for everybody. So I don't think anyone's got the stomach for answering any of the deep questions that are raised by the chronic problems of South Africa. Either you say the world's going to be this slow, grinding, grey, bureaucratic sludge that crimps the birth rate of the global population until some kind of alternative system can emerge, or you go to war. So I think it's, yeah, I mean, these are hard bloody questions. Do you live in a prison or a cage match? Is that going to be your model for humanity? Which one would you prefer?
America seems to be trying to figure that one out. They seem to be. America is a country of incredible dynamism, aren't they? They will
they're the only country that can go for the third option.
Yeah.
Them and Russia, right? They're the only countries that are truly resource self-sufficient. They're the only countries that can go for a third option. They can say, actually, we're not playing this game anymore. Bye-bye, world. And I mean, notice Russia's foreign policy. Everyone talks about how aggressive they are and everything, but they're really just sort of saying, well, you guys are going to stay this far away from us or you're in trouble. And don't come anywhere near us and you'll be fine. And I think that if America goes the same route, I think an ideal world scenario would actually paradoxically be if America and Russia find a way to make peace with each other. Because if they do that, they both take a sort of semi-isolationist policy, and then the rest becomes a competition between Europe and China, which, yes, Europe, India and China, sorry, shall I say. And that can lead to, no one knows how that's going to turn out. I mean, you can say, okay, well, Europe's in the doldrums, they're not doing too well, whatever. But Europe is a very strange part of the world. And I think that if they go through a serious civilizational crisis, they'll come out a much nastier and toothier beastie than they have been in recent years. And it might get ugly for a while, but nothing stays in one position for very long. And I think that in the long run, you might see sort of a very, very ancient balance of forces re-emerging.
Yeah, it's very difficult to sort of gauge where the winds of this seeming like post Pax Americana is going to take us.
Well, I hope that America decides to just isolate, because the alternative is that they drag everyone into a global conflict. Whereas if they choose to hide amongst themselves, you have isolated competition between different centers of power that can't really expand into global nuclear war. If America does decide to try and preserve its hegemonic position, you could see some truly catastrophic fireworks. So I think the ideal scenario is that they take the isolationist path and retire with grace.
Yeah, I have a suspicion that America doesn't intend to go out without a fight in that regard.
Well, no, I don't know. I wouldn't call that going out without a fight, because they have fights to work out internally. They have to work out what it means to be American. I mean, George Hegel, sorry. Why did I call it Friedrich Hegel? Is my brain frying? It's probably a bit late.
You managed to mix him up with the Friedrich Hayek as well.
Friedrich. No, but Hegel made an observation about about America, where he says that America really hasn't come into its own until it's settled all of the land, enclosed all of the territory, and has become, in a sense, like Europe, completely settled, and class hierarchy emerges. And we're getting to that point now where America gets to decide what it really is. So the frontier is actually a kind of interregnum, and would, everyone thinks about America, that being its spirit. I think that it's much like Rome, in the sense that Rome liked to imagine itself as this agrarian economy that it was in the first century, or a century or so of the Republic, century or two. Once they'd conquered Italy, they became a different thing. They were an empire. They're completely different. And America was, colonies with a frontier where, anyone who gets sick of the bureaucracy and gets sick of crowded city society strikes on there and does what they like. That is coming to an end. Europe went, the UK, Britain went through an enclosure movement that put an end to the social relations of the time in order to embrace modern capitalism. And the United States has gone through the same process, only at a much more technologically intense stage. So now I think you're going to, the class tensions are going to emerge, and you're going to start seeing, well, we're going to see what America actually is made of. I think I think that's the real hard question. Is the thing that's happening now with Donald Trump is they're going to define the stage on which that identity is decided. And in South Africa, we have already defined that stage in 1994. We haven't made the decision yet. We keep postponing it. And I think America can postpone it for quite a while, but it will come to a head at some point. And, either different parts of the country go their separate ways and they figure out some kind of ugly stasis that doesn't really please anyone. And we haven't even gotten there yet ourselves. But I don't see America as being, in essence, the things that it has been. I think this is actually an embryonic stage in the long sweep of history. And we're going to have to see what happens when, like you get this, like the writings of Joel Kotkin, we talk about like this hyper-feudalism, where you've got this permanent floating elite that can have an impersonal version of the feudal relationship with millions of people at a time, with billions of people, such that it's almost they're untouchable, they're unaccountable. There's no sort of honor relationship or anything. It's just this very sort of static subordinate relationship, which they're going to increasingly resemble the kinds of caricatures that Marx generally made about capitalist society. And I think you hear people pointing at the Communist Party and things like that in America when you watch like Twitter discourse, and they'll say, this doesn't reflect who we are, what we are. And I think you don't know yet, actually, because you're not what you think you are anymore.
Yeah, it's so difficult when you're sort of trying to grapple with essentially your sort of internal theory of existence, right? But you're trying to figure out things that truthfully are almost not for you to figure out. You can't really understand your position in the universe or your position in history because you're the one standing there. You lack the perspective of what other people see you as and where you are in relation to them. You need a level of insight that I frankly think is lacking in.
Look at it at an individual level. Look at it at an individual level. So let's say you're going through the same crisis as a person. Let's take, for example, the Buddhist spiritual perspective, where the soul is not, the mind is not a single unity. Everything that sort of makes you up is actually many different things going on, signals coming from the body, and this thing that you are, the central perspective, is not really in control of what's going on. Now, that's true of a country as well. There are many moving parts. I mean, what is the actual essence that's going on that unifies this thing that we call a country, a nation, a people, whatever? This is a mystery. But you will find moments in your life where you do have a sense of untouchable certainty about something. And in those moments, you'll make decisions that radically alter the entire course of your life, for good or ill. And when a society discovers who they are in some sense, or at least who they are in that moment, that tends to cause shockwaves that destroy entire regions, you know. Nazi Germany had a moment like that. Russia had a moment. France had a moment. Rwanda had two moments, in very quick succession. And the whole of Central Africa paid in millions and millions of lives over the following 30 years. I think that if America has to answer that question, you have to ask yourself, what does it look like if they decide one way or the other? And I think that regardless of which side finds that kind of transcendental inspiration in their sense of identity, which side of America, people are going to concentration camps. And I mean, it might not happen now in 20 years or 30 years or 50 years, who knows? But there are sort of two answers out there at the moment of who we are, what we are, kind of a question. And either side that wins, there's going to be hell to pay. The same goes for Europe. I mean, and Europe's question is much starker because it's very obvious. It's very obvious what it means in Europe. In America, it's not clear yet. There's still that sort of starry-eyed notion that we have infinite space, that we can do anything, that everyone can be all they want to be at the same time in the same place. Whereas in Europe, that kind of thinking has never taken place. No one has ever thought that. There's always been an understanding that we are going to come up with one answer, and it's going to be that we are going to be what we always have been, and only that, or we are going to be everything and everyone is going to go along with it. And the thing is that they now have a third option, which is suicide.
I mean,
no country ever placed that option as a live option before them, and Europe has consciously placed suicide as a live option in their civilizational discourse. So it's a crazy thing to watch. It's a crazy thing to watch.
Yeah, it's just we
as South Africans, we have too decided that suicide is an option on the table. Not many of us are seriously looking at it. In fact, most of us don't. But you know what? Amongst white South Africans, you have surely met one or two people who think that yes, we as an ethnic group, we as a recognized conscious continuum should commit suicide. And the same goes for these existential questions are coming down the pipeline really hard. And one wonders whether it's, just the internet age or what it is that's forcing these questions upon us. But I think what it is we still feel we have time to play with. For some reason, even though we're much closer to conflagration, economic collapse, whatever, we still feel we've got more time to play with than the Europeans and the Americans do. This I cannot fathom. We know that we're closer to the breadline as a society. We know that the state is more fragile over here than it is there. And yet somehow we feel, no, we've got plenty of time to figure out what we're doing.
Yeah, I think it's probably down to the fact that there have been, I mean, several. I mean, the big one would be the transition period, but South Africa is a country that, in relatively recent memory, have felt what it's like to be on the precipice of total collapse and then come back from it and then dance with it a little bit more and then come back to, and I think we've come quite numb to that feeling, so we don't really engage with it as start like it doesn't feel like it's something that is
Yeah, we
actually
feel
going to
we'll
happen.
figure it out. We'll kick the can down the road again.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, it's like, oh well, post 1990, when it was the primary objective was avoiding a civil war. You successfully avoided it, so if we survive that, can't get that worse, can it?
Yeah. I think it's funny. I think part of it is, there's a recognition of the mortality that we have that leads us to a sort of more pragmatic resignation. And I think amongst the African population, there's a recognition of weakness rather than mortality that sort of says, well, maybe we can't lift the stone. Maybe we should just let it lie. And I think perhaps it's defeatism that allows us to survive next to each other.
That's another thing I've been thinking about. Like, how can you really, like, people always speak about how, violence begets violence. Poverty often breeds radical ideology. What if we've just reached a point where people are so just continuously bound up in their own poverty, misery, and violence that they don't actually have time to think about these things? And so they
That's
never
that's a
foster
fair
that.
point. That's a fair point. I think that you know, but I think it's a U-shaped curve. So if you're a very wealthy country, you get very intensely passionate about existential questions, and if you are starving, you get intensely passionate about existential questions. But of course, they take on a very different shape. And then there's this middle where you've got a lot of people who are too poor to have luxury beliefs, but too well fed to kill their neighbors for bread. And I think we're sitting right in the bottom of that bell curve, quite possibly.
Thank God for the ANC for their wealth distribution programs, keeping us from that one end of the U shape.
I mean, that's the question. That's the thing that the DA are betting on, is that we can somehow stimulate enough growth that we never have to actually confront the mathematics behind that.
Oh,
We
yeah.
because if we don't grow 3% a year, we don't start getting up to that very soon, then we are facing a fiscal crisis, and that means cutting expenditure, and that means no more free services, no more free lunch, and that means your neighbor's bread starts looking a little bit. Your neighbor's bread looks more desirable than the crumbs on your plate. Then we have difficulty. Then we have difficulty. I mean, it's that we can support the tiny little population in the country that survives by picking through people's bins. That can't get too much bigger, because I mean, hell's bells. I mean, the second you're getting the point where you can count that in percentiles, then you are going to then it's all going to fall apart very rapidly. I mean, Venezuela is an interesting example because the state survived the process. Zimbabwe, the state survived the process. I think that people underestimate what the state can survive, what they can tolerate.
Although it's a big difference between essentially totalitarian regimes versus a country that, for all of its faults, is remarkably democratic.
Well, that's the thing. I actually think, looking at those countries, that they're not, those two examples, is that they're not actually as totalitarian as people give them credit for. They're very authoritarian, but they're not actually, I suspect they're not actually as big in thought policing as people think. It's just that, yeah, as long as you don't actually threaten our concrete power, we're fine. And if you've destroyed the society so completely, in a world where all of your neighbors are wealthier than you and you can just emigrate, you've got a natural pressure valve on all of that. So you can actually get as ugly as you like in the way that you govern your people, and they'll never rebel. The real black pill for me is looking at North Korea, because nobody escapes, millions starve, and there's no revolution.
Well, there's a continuous revolution, you know.
Well, you know what I mean. You know what I mean. It's one of
Yeah.
those things where people always suspect, oh, we'll do something. You know, it'll get bad enough that people wake up. I don't believe that's actually a phenomenon. I really don't. I
Yeah,
think
well,
that's
to
one of those
yeah,
things where, yeah,
well, yeah, to raise your fists, you first need the literally the calorie intake to have the strength to do so. So
well, indeed. But I think the question that I think it's a more mysterious question. It's quite like, you know, people who are stuck in a cycle of depression and anxiety. If you want to get out of it, the only way to get out of it is to just choose to get out of it. You know, you're either riding the roller coaster or you're riding the roller coaster. You know, so I think, yeah, I think it's a true paradox. As long as people are waiting, I watched an interview with Peter Thiel recently, and he said something very interesting. He said that absolute optimism and absolute pessimism are both paralyzing, because if you're too optimistic, then you'll wait for someone to take care of the problem. You just watch the future as a movie. And if you're too pessimistic, then you say, well, then there's nothing I can do, so I might as well do nothing. So, and what's really peculiar is I have conversations with people every day where they exhibit both about the same issues within the space of a minute. There's this absolute psychic paralysis across the board.
yeah, because no one we're entering, or not entering. We've fully established ourselves in a peculiar time where materially basically everyone is pretty well off, right? Like no one's starving, no one's we can afford these incredibly luxurious items like a laptop or like a cell phone, things that can keep us endlessly distracting, whilst at the same time we are like in this like deeply troubled time on a sort of spiritual level. And it's not very common that those two things intersect. They normally act in parallel to each other.
No, I think the way we can sum all of this up is really just to say we have been postponing a decision.
Yeah.
And the Americans, the difference between us and them is that they've made their decision and they don't know what it means yet. So we know what the decision means and we refuse to take it. They take the decision but don't know what it means. So
we can maybe we can communicate with each other, try to figure it out together. Maybe that's what the negotiations are for the development group. What's it that we're negotiating with the Americans for right now?
Oh no, that's hell's bells. I have no idea what the hell they're leveraging for, but the livelihoods of several thousand farmers will depend on it. So you know, hopefully we hopefully we manage to box our corner reasonably well. That's all I can say.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, on that note, I'm going to end the stream. And for the couple of people who did manage to tune in, good night, good luck, and hopefully the week doesn't steamroller you. Have fun.